Joining us for Pete's Pedal, the whole story. I know lots of us were following Peter's progress on Facebook, but I'm really hoping his talk tonight will bring this whole journey, cycling the watershed, together. I'm looking forward to lots of photographs as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Penny. I'm the CEO at the Green Team. And before I introduce Peter properly, I just want to tell you why he's such an important figure in the Green Team. It was Peter who first envisioned the Green Team way back in 1995. And it was not long after the Rio Earth Summit when we were all encouraged to think global and act local. And it was him that saw the need for young people to be actively involved in environmental volunteering, not just for what they could give back, but what they actually got from feeling connected to the natural world. So 26 years later, Peter is our esteemed Green Team patron. And when he offered to do some fundraising for us by cycling the Watershed of Scotland, we were absolutely delighted and very grateful. We've chosen to dedicate the funds that he has raised to a programme which we're calling Time in Nature, which supports local young carers to take time out of their caring responsibilities and enjoy some time in nature together. These fantastic young people who spend a lot of their time looking after others have described outdoor experiences with the Green Team so positively. And they tell us things like, it takes my mind off lots of things in real life that are happening, and that it gives them a break from everything. So it's obviously really important stuff, really important work to do. And we're delighted to say that with your help, Peter has raised a whopping £5,163. And we aim to start our work with young carers in the new year when the weather's a little bit better than it is now. If you haven't already donated, and I know lots of you have, there will be a chance to do so at the end of the talk. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. So please keep yourself on mute. If you don't want to have your camera on, it's absolutely fine to turn it off. And if you select speaker view rather than gallery, you'll see a little bit more of Peter, unless of course you want to have a look at all the other lovely faces who are on the talk. So there'll be a chance for you to ask questions at the end, and the way that we're going to do this is by encouraging you to put your questions in the chat box. So if something occurs to you sort of halfway through, pop your question in there and we'll try to get through all the questions at the end. So Peter, it's over to you for Pete's Pedal, the whole story.
Well, there we go, the whole story. I have to start and say that actually that's quite a tall order, because we've only got, is it about 35 minutes? And I was pedaling for 24 days. And to cram all that in somehow is quite a challenge. So it'll be some of the edited highlights and some of the experiences that I had along the way. So Pete's Pedal has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? I discovered in the early days of the planning this new fancy new technology thing of QR codes. So a number of covers for my panniers and my backpack were made up with this information on it, and critically the QR code. And I have to say that I hadn't used QR codes very much. And I was just amazed. I met so many lovely people, and they would say, can I donate something? How do I donate? And I would get my backpack off and say, do get your camera out and take a photograph of that. And it may have been right out in the middle of nowhere. And it would take them straight to Givey.com, the fundraising platform. And I have to say, I was blown away by that bit of technology stuff. But it worked. And there were some people who took photographs of it at the time and then came back subsequently and made donations and made comments like, "Do you remember me? We met in a bothy," or somewhere like that. So this technology was an absolute godsend. And having the strapline, young carers, time in nature, linking in with Penny's lovely introduction, just pressed all the buttons for me in terms of pedaling for 24 days. So the watershed. I wasn't cycling the watershed because, do you know what? My name is not Danny McCaskill. The watershed is uncyclable, and even if it was, I wouldn't recommend it because it wouldn't be very good for it. So I was shadowing the watershed, cycling as close as I could to it, south to north, with two things in mind: safety and my vintage, because, you know, I am 74 years of age. So shadowing the watershed, but let me tell you what the watershed is first. So I'm going to invite you to use your imagination and think raindrop. Imagine you're a raindrop. And if you're living in the Teviot Valley just now, you'll know all about raindrops because there's flooding in that area now this evening. But anyway, imagine you're a raindrop and you're about to land on Scotland, and you've probably got some of your pals round about you. Your destiny, dear raindrop, when you do land, is that you'll start another journey by bog. Oh yes, bog, burn and river. And you'll end up in either the North Sea or the Atlantic Ocean. And which it is to be will be determined pretty exactly by which side of that line you land on. So it's the watershed or water divide, and in some respects, the spine of Scotland. And as you can see, it roughly follows the higher ground. So that's the watershed. And one of the delightful things for me about it is that it was created entirely by nature, not by us. Okay, we may have mucked around with it in places, but it was formed in what we'll call geoglacial time, many, many thousands of years ago, and in some cases, millions of years ago. And probably the last final change to it, which might have been in the Loch Lomond area, was about 12,000 years ago. So it's been there a long, long time. And it's been my great pleasure to be having walked the whole thing in 2005 and been blown away by the whole experience, and now written 4 books on the subject. No, I haven't made very much money out of that. But anyway, it's been my great pleasure to share it in so many ways, and deciding that now that my big walking days are over, that to be able to cycle it up a lot of up and down, tremendous pleasure. Yes, a tremendous pleasure most of the time. So that's the watershed. And I was zigzagging backwards and forwards, east and west, north and south, and I probably crossed it about 25 times, but I wasn't counting. So on the start, Penny and the minibus, Penny got permission from the Forestry Commission to drive the minibus with me and my bike in it, all the way up to almost the English border, not quite, we'll come back to that in a minute. But right up to the end of the forestry road to a Bílach, where we could see the English border, in fact. Most of that day and much of the next few days was cycling on forestry roads, though not all of it, as you will see. And there you can see proudly on the right, the Green Team logo and the strapline connecting young people with nature. So I'm smiling, eagerly waiting to go, raring to go with my bike all loaded up. And I have to say a thing about the bike, The bike is about 10 years old. It's done a lot of miles, and a former friend and colleague, or I should say former colleague and friend, Kyle Strachan, very kindly rebuilt parts of the bike, including all the gear system and the brakes and all the things that I kind of needed. So the bike was in tip-top, really good condition when I set off. I think it's still in good condition. So later that day, I decided that I would have to stop for a wee brew up. I had a routine. It's a routine that I've evolved over the last 17, 18 years of cycling or walking for a couple of hours, then stopping for a break, another couple of hours or 2.5 hours, lunch, and so on throughout the day. And so I was always stocking up with nourishment. And I found this lovely place to stop, and that's looking back to the beginning. So the beginning, the hill in the middle is Peel Fell, which is on the English border, and the one on the left is Hartshorn Pike, and the starting point was in the forest right between them, and that's where the minibus was. So I cycled through the area that you can see. A lot of this account that I'm giving of this venture is, I'm afraid, fast forward, because we can't fit the whole thing in. But it was always nice to stop and have a brew up and have a wee look at the scenery. The next day, I joined a public road that goes from Howick to Newcastleton, and then had to cut west past Hermitage Castle to take me through to the A7. And Hermitage Castle, very impressive place and made famous by people like Mary Queen of Scots and so on. But the watershed, it has to be said, the watershed is a couple of kilometres behind Hermitage. The watershed is a great big emptiness. Although it's 1,200 kilometres long, there are only about 25 houses on it. So it's a really big emptiness. It's quite remarkable. But when you think of it, the watershed is not the right place to have a settlement, because there's no ready water supply. It's all flowing away. So there is one settlement, and I want you to promise, you'll keep your faces straight when I say the one settlement is Cumbernauld Newtown. That is the only settlement, and it's the Newtown part, and I did cycle through it, that's actually on the watershed. And then I met these, just not long after Hermitage, I met these lovely cattle. There were a few others in the field. Belted Galloway coos. There's something very, very distinctive about them. Black and white on the back and front, and this white stripe in the middle. And although they're associated with Galloway, they're seen everywhere. And in fact, a distant relative who follows my family history project, who lives in Melbourne, was saying that they even see Galloway coos in Australia, much to his great delight, because he grew up in Scotland. So these coos were very contented. I had to take a photograph. No apology, a bit of a fast forward to Megget Reservoir. So to get here, I've been through a Crake Forest, where I encountered a nightmare of having to try and follow a path that was marked on the map. But oh, it wasn't there on the ground, because since the map was created, the area had been planted with trees, and then the wind came along and blew a lot of the trees down. So I had a kilometre to battle through these huge trees lying all over the place. But I survived, and I came out. And when I came out, there was a clump of wild raspberries waiting to be consumed. They were delicious. So from Crake to Ettrick, and then along to Tibby Shields. These are the kind of landmarks that people would know about on the road. The Gordon Arms, St Mary's Loch, and then a fairly hefty ascent up to Megget Reservoir. And for those of you who live in Edinburgh and the Lothians, this is your water supply. And you'll see there's a bit of bigger tide mark around it. And that means that the level is getting low. You're drinking too much. You're flushing the loo too much. So think about that. But there are quite a number of reservoirs in that area that all feed Edinburgh. And one of the things that delights me about that is when I say feed, the water gets to you by gravity. It's not pumped to Edinburgh. It just flows all the way down from Megget to your tap in your bathroom. So another a bit of an ascent beyond Megget, and there's something wonderful about getting to a pass between the hills and knowing that you've cycled all the way uphill and it's going to be downhill for a bit. With a bit of freewheeling. Oh, that's great. So I did stop and I took the photograph, and I love this photograph. There's not much in it, but you see that road just curving off round, and you wonder what's round the corner other than a load of downhill. And this is what was round the corner. Tala Reservoir, again part of Edinburgh. The watershed is along the top of the hills that you can see away on the horizon above Tweedsmuir, and the land on the left is part of Tala and Gameshope, which is one of the Borders Forest Trust's biggest properties, where they're regenerating native woodland. And there's my bike, all loaded up with all the gear. It weighs in, without me on it, at about 26 kilograms. So it puts a bit of effort into getting those pedals to go round. When Kyle rebuilt the bike, he added extra gears, and it now has 24 gears in it. I've never had a bike in my life with that number of gears. I don't know, Kyle, if I used all of them, but I was so glad to have the bike in tip-top condition. And in the foreground is my beautiful Jetboil that I bought in 2004 in readiness for my big epic walk along the entire watershed. And it's basically the same Jetboil. It's had one or two wee repairs, and I do all my cooking on it. And I've got it down to a fine art as to how best to use it, what kind of food and all the rest. The cylinders, they're the smallest size, last about 3 days. And that's very useful in the planning, because I had to do a lot of strategic planning, and I enjoy the strategic planning. Those of you who worked with me when I was in the D&V unit will probably chuckle and laugh and think about the last thing that man ever did was have spreadsheets and schedules and all that pre-arranging stuff. Things just somehow happened. But now it's all down in black and white and different colors, so that I know day to day what I'm doing. And I had a printout of that with me. And about every fourth night or thereabouts, I had to arrange to have somewhere to stay, whether it was camping or staying in somebody's house, so that I could recharge the batteries for my phone, my boosters, have a food parcel waiting for me, and get water as well. So all that was pre-arranged, and it worked very well. And so I stopped with this view, a lovely view down Tala Reservoir. And then I went on to down Tweedsmuir to Broughton, where I was very well looked after for the night. And I was invited to join a meeting of the Grumpy Old Men's Club that meets at 5 o'clock on a Friday in somebody's polytunnel. And they all bring their own beer. And I have to say, it was anything but grumpy. It was a jolly experience. So it was lovely to do that. And I was well looked after. The blue thing on the back of my bike is a bag that I made myself out of a bit of a tarpaulin and some gaffer tape. And sitting on top of that's got my tent in it, by the way. And on top of it is my trowel. If you're going into the outdoors, you have to have a trowel. You can work out for yourself what the trowel is for. But I had one with me all the way and I used it. So I went from Broughton to Biggar and then moving into what either past or present is a more industrial area to cross the Central Belt. And so I fast forward again across the Central Belt and then right through the Trossachs. And a lot of that was on wonderful forestry roads. So those are roads that were originally made purely for forestry purposes, but have now been largely repurposed for cycling and walking and dog walking and all the rest. And then this is Loch Lubnig with the public road on the far side. Strathair is somewhere up at the head of the loch. And along this west side is the old railway, which is now a beautiful cycle track, lovely cycling. And we'll come on to that just again in a minute. But you can't, when you see a view like that, you can't do anything other than stop and take a wee photograph or two. And this is a bit further up in Glenogle. So the public road is over on the right-hand side. And if you've driven up there, you'll know that there's this wonderful viaduct. Now, it was a railway. And there is a story that it was a rockfall that killed the railway. My theory is the rock that killed the railway was Dr. Beeching. And certainly the railway closed round about that time, and it was a great loss. But it's now a wonderful cycleway, and it is maintained by Sustrans. And so to get up to that level, they have constructed a wonderful zigzag of beautifully tarmacked cycleway to get up to the level of this cycleway. And from Glenogle, I then went over the edge, as it were, and down to Lixtoll, and then I joined the public road. Lixtoll to Crianlarich was okay because it's a nice big wide road, but north of Crianlarich, it narrows a bit, and the traffic was bad. There had been a fatality in that area, and a cyclist of my age, which kind of put the heebie-jeebies up me a bit. So I confess that when I got to Tindrum, when I stopped for a brew up, I decided to get the train to Carrúr. I knew I was going to have to get the train anyway to get across Ranach Moor. And so I went to Carrúr. And this is the view that greeted me when I got out of my tent in the morning at Carrúr, just beside the restaurant. I was very well looked after by the restaurant. They even left the back door open at night so I could get in and use the loo. How good is that? But I have to tell you that in the evening, the midges were horrendous. But in the morning, all was well. And that's looking towards Ben Alder. The bumpy hill in the middle is Ben Alder, and the hills on the mountains on the right are all part of the watershed. And the pass that you can see at the lowest point, shrouded in mist, is called the Bealach Dhu, or the Black Bealach. Somebody gave it that name a long time ago. And so I'm on Carrúr Estate here, which of course the Rousing family are doing a fantastic job at regenerating. One of the first things that they did was to reduce the deer population by 75%. And now it is working wonderfully to enable native trees and woodlands to regenerate naturally. And they do have a wonderful network of estate roads, lovely cycling. Then down to the far end of Loch Lagan and up the track on the west side or south side of Loch Lagan to this wonderful beach that everyone has seen. It featured in Monarch of the Glen, of course, because Ardvericke is just on the left. I didn't camp on the beach. I camped in the Pinewood at the head of the loch, thinking the midges would be grim.
Very briefing.
But to my delight, there were no midges. And then the next day I had to come up out of that glen and over into the Spey and go up the Spey to go over the Corrieric Pass and General Wade's Military Road. I did it about 3 years ago and vowed I would never do it again. But it was on the route, so I had to do it. And you can see the line of the road contouring initially, and then it zigzags up. 14 different zigzags, all the way, all beautifully engineered, up to 770 meters and almost the height of the watershed. And those pylons that you can see are part of the very controversial Bewley to Denny line. But I have to say that I'm with the pylons because the alternative in that area would have been unthinkable. And then I got to the top, up to the 770 meter point, and I stopped for my lunch. I had a lovely lunch, and it was a lovely sunny day, as you can see. So yes, I lay down in the sun amongst the wildflowers and had a beautiful nap. And then got up, got myself organized and surveyed the view in all directions. And then down out of the Corrieric towards Fort Augustus, which is just around the corner there, and that's Loch Ness. And I'll leave you to decide for yourselves what those black marks in Loch Ness might be. But I can tell you that my grandmother, who was a very God-fearing woman, was convinced that she had seen the Loch Ness Monster back in the 1930s. So who would I be to disagree with that? So down to Fort Augustus. And then we do a lot of fast forwarding because I came out of the Great Glen and over into Glen Shiel, and then to Strome Ferry. So at that point, I'm right on the west coast, having to swing quite a long way from the watershed. And then right across, almost the other side of Scotland to Garve, and then up past Loch Blascarnach and heading down towards Ullapool. And when I saw bridges beside the road, or I was crossing bridges, I always like to have a look at the water. There's something magical about running water. And this is the start of the Corrishalach Gorge. So the water runs off the edge of the stones that you can see at the end, and then it goes down into a very dramatic gorge, which is one of the National Trust for Scotland's great projects. So I had to be very organized, and somehow I knew I was going to have to have a food parcel and resupply and charge my phone and all the rest. At Ullapool, the outdoor shop in Ullapool were very helpful with some of that. But somehow, somebody put me onto this wonderful place. It's an eco-settlement about 2 miles short of Ullapool called West Edge. And it's built in an area of forest that the Forestry Commission should probably never have planted in the first place because they found that it had no commercial value whatsoever. So they sold it to some of it to somebody who's created this wonderful eco-village using stuff that other people no longer needed. Made very welcome. We're looking straight at the open-air kitchen, the outdoor kitchen. And to the left of it, and just round the corner, is an alfresco shower. So I was asked, would I like a shower? And I said, well, that would be very nice, thank you. So the boiler was duly lit, and in 20 minutes, there was plenty of hot water for a sort of alfresco shower. There was, it wasn't completely alfresco. And a little bit further down, and I have to say downstream, is their composting toilet. And I was very well looked after there, made most welcome. And the great thing is that I was able to recharge my phone by electricity that had been garnered or gleaned from solar panels. Somebody had stored it on a big booster. And so I was able to recharge my phone with solar power. That was rather special. And then onwards, I went through Ullapool and then turned northeast up through Redorach, 2 big estates. My favourite area on the watershed, I would have to say, and the mystery part of my novel, Waking the Sleeping Giant, is actually set in the higher ground of Redorach. It just seemed like the right kind of place to set the scene. And most of the initial part of the track is good cycling up to the higher of the 2 lodges, and then it kind of deteriorates a bit and gets very, very steep and twisty and rocky. So again, I did what I had done on the Corrie Eric. I had to push and heave and haul my bike up to where the watershed crosses the track. And this is the point, the high point where the watershed crosses the track, or the track crosses the watershed. For those of you who are Monroeists, Sean of Ray, a great favourite, very remote, is out there a bit to the left. And I think I stopped here for a brew up. And then that night I stayed in Knockdamf, Bothy, and I was sharing the place with 4 other people. And we were sharing stories about what they were doing. They were doing the Cape Wrath Trail in various different ways. And it was then that QR code came to the fore, because the cameras were out, click, click, our phones were out, and money ensued, albeit sometimes a week or 2 later. So I love Redorach, even if it was an awful journey to get up to this high point. And I love the Bothy. And now, again, fast forward from Redorach, down Strathoico and over the hill to Lairg and the bottom end of Loch Shin. And again, I was very, very well looked after. Oh, I received such wonderful kindness from people. And if any of you are watching just now, all I can say is my heartfelt thanks to you. You made me so welcome and looked after me. And one of the first things you see on the lower part of Loch Shin is what's called the Wee Hoosie. Now, I don't know what the story behind the construction of the Wee Hoosie is, but it's a delightful thing, so I just had to take a photograph of it before I then headed north, heading for Altnahara, I think, but I came to the Craskin beside the road, and I love the Craskin. The story of this place would fill a whole evening. It is uniquely owned by the Scottish Episcopal Church. Now, I'm not a particularly religious person, although the Scottish Episcopal Church has cropped up a lot in my family history research. And I've discovered that it is, of the bigger churches in Scotland, it is probably one of the most inclusive. And it's certainly the only bigger church that could possibly own a licensed pub, hotel, inn. So yes, I stopped for coffee and a scone, and I had a chat and reminisced in my mind about previous visits to the Craskin. It's off-grid, so they have a generator and sundry other ways of generating electricity. And it's right beside the road, very remote, and I would give it 5 stars, definitely. And then another, it's almost at the highest point. The word Crask, by the way, means the crossing point, and therefore it is almost at the crossing point, the watershed. And then beautiful downhill all the way to Altnahara, then turned right or heading east along Loch Naver. And halfway along Loch Naver, I decided, oh, it's time for a cup of tea, a brew up. So I found a suitable spot to park myself, my bike, and my bag and have a brew up. And when I took my bag off, here's this wee character has hitched a lift on my backpack. I do not know when or how it joined me on the journey. It probably hadn't been with me all that long, but there it was. So I put the bag down gently and let it decide where it wanted to go. I don't know if there are any botanists amongst us who would know whether it's, from what you can see, whether it's a male or a female. Not that it matters, but it was quite happy for a wee while. And then when I'd finished my brew up, it must have got the signal that I was about to move on. So when I looked round, it had gone back into the undergrowth. And so I continued eastward past Russell, where all sorts of bad things happened during the clearances. And this is all right in the middle of the flow country. And the flow country is, there's no other word will describe it than iconic. There's probably more carbon in the flow country, in the bog and peat, than the rest of Scotland put together. Yes, there are a few hills, but there's a tremendous amount of bog. And leading the way in amongst all of this is the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. They have their biggest reserve at Forcenard, which I passed a wee bit further on. And this loch, this wee loch, with Ben Grean Beg and Ben Grean Moor in the background, is called Palm Loch. Now, how on earth it got the name Palm Loch, I know not, because there are no palms growing anywhere near it. Nice place to stop briefly and then continue on the journey. And I've walked this area, I've cycled it, and I just love it. And the flow country is in the running to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So it's going to join some of the very, very top heritage sites in the whole world. And I hope the process takes a long time, but I hope that it is successful. And if my distant relative, Bridget Primrose, is listening to me, she will know exactly what I'm talking about. It's just, initially I thought the flow country would be a bit flat and dull and boring when I was planning my big walk, but it was anything but. It was filled with light and colour and movement and the wide skies. And yes, you'll have gathered, I love the flow country. And then I went past Forcenard, well looked after. There was a food parcel waiting for me. And although I wasn't staying actually in Forcenard, I was given a shower, and that was absolutely great. And then I cycled through some of the area where the RSPB have chopped down millions and millions of trees that should never have been planted in the first place. And they've blocked up the drains, and the water table is rising. And it's amazing how quickly the habitat begins to recover. So I then get to a very remote railway station called Altnabrek. It's one of these request stops. And one of the things I like about it is that the private foresters in that area that still have got forest have got together, and they've pooled the resources to build a siding at Altnabrek station, so that the logs that they cut down in the forest can be taken by forestry road to Altnabrek. They will then be loaded onto trains and then travel south for processing by the train load, and not by hundreds and hundreds of lorry loads on the public roads. So that's why I'm smiling. I think that's a fantastic piece of planning. And then we're really nearing the end of the journey. The weather had been great. The only wet day had been the day I arrived way back in Shotts. No, yes, Shotts. The last day, the second last day was a bit misty. And then as I got to Duncansby Head, I was in the mist. But there was a wee welcoming party of 3 people there. People who'd really gone out of their way to welcome me. And they'd travelled some distance to get there. And one of them was a freelance press guy. And so there was an article in the John O'Groats Journal about this journey. And so I'm filmed here emerging from the mist, cycling towards the trig point and the welcoming party. But just before we get to the trig point, let me tell you about all those black blobs on the grass. The farmer who has the grazing at Duncansby Head was plagued, absolutely plagued by camper vans and too much wild camping. And it was making life impossible. Now, he couldn't close the road. This is a public road right up to the lighthouse. So, clever man, he got in touch with all his neighbouring farmers and said, bring your sheep. And so all the sheep in the area were herded onto Duncansby Head, and they munched the grass, and the result of the munching of the grass is seen on the ground. And the camper vans somehow stopped making a nuisance of themselves, and the wild camping. It didn't solve the problem altogether, but it really made life an awful lot easier. So we may not love sheep, but in that situation, they served their purpose. Although I have to say that by the time my bike came home, it still had some sheep poo on the tires. And then the finish line, woo, journey's end. 24 days of cycling, 950 kilometers, and you can do your arithmetic if you like. I had a measured approach to it. I wasn't trying to overdo it every day with my bike being so heavily laden. Question mark about the number of calories burned, but I did lose some weight. And as Penny has told us, we have now exceeded the £5,000 mark. And initially I thought that's never going to be achievable. And there you go, we have done it. And so I was euphoric when I got to Duncansby Head, and the other people that were there shared in my excitement. Some of the tourists who were there were a bit bemused by all this carry on, but what an achievement. And the 74-year-old old codger is very happy to have done it. So thank you for joining me, and to everyone who has donated. And I know, I've been told that a lot of you have been listening to this. So my thanks. I know Penny has said thank you, but I really add my sincere thanks. You made all that pedaling worth it. And then when the Green Team are working with the young carers next summer, that really will be the payoff. So there you go. You can still donate, and the QR code I think still works. And so, yes, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening. And now I'm going to hand back to Penny.
Yep, absolutely. Peter, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Your animation and the way that you speak about it was captured, I think, in some of the little video clips that you were sending back and posting on your Facebook page. And it was just so amusing to hear you, because you were just still being so enthusiastic, and it was really wonderful. And your beard was getting longer and longer as the days went on. So it was really good to see. Anyway, thank you so much for taking us through all of that. We do have some questions for you if you are happy to answer them. So we're going to kick off first of all with one from Sally Ann. And Sally Ann is asking, just how bad were those midges?
Well, it varied. And it varied almost from night to night. I mean, contrast my experience at Career, where they were grim, and then at Loch Lagan, never a midge in sight. The next night I was camping at Melgarve Bothy, which was actually locked. It's a private bothy, and the midges were fearsome. So it varied greatly from day to day, evening to evening. I had a midge net, and I'm quite good at being able to handle the dreaded midge, but I guess we would rather that they weren't there.
Yes, well, it's good to just accept them and embrace them into your life and deal with them. So we've got some kind of logistical questions coming up. I don't know if there's anybody out there who's thinking of doing a similar sort of journey, but we've got a question about your food parcels, and I know you had to do, your spreadsheets and all your coloured boxes and all of that. And I worked with you. You were always really strategic. Anyway, so we've got a question about, what was your most common staple in your food parcels, and also what one item in your packing list could you not have done without?
Ooh. Well, I'll run you through my daily diet very quickly. Breakfast is muesli with extra cranberries added, and boiling water added. And so once that's cooled down, I eat it, and I call it Pete's porridge. And the extra cranberries, I'm told, give that extra oomph. Cold tea, not cold tea, black tea. I don't bother with milk because that just messes everything up. And that was breakfast. Mid-morning, a chocolate or a giant bar, along with some black tea. Lunch would be, and I hope nobody's going to throw up their hands in horror when I say this, but it was something like pot noodle, because it's very easy to repackage in a very small space, then pour it into my cup and add the boiling water, and usually a biscuit, and perhaps some nuts and raisins. That's lunch. Afternoon tea is the same as morning coffee, morning tea. My one indulgence was main meal, along with some pita bread, of these ready-made meals. They are quite expensive, $4.50 to $5.50, but they're very easy to reconstitute or heat, and with a bit of pita bread. And I would probably have some gingerbread with it as well, and more black tea. I did carry hot chocolate with me, but I very rarely used it. So that was it from day to day. Although it has to be said that when I was staying with people, and it has to be said too, at the restaurant at Career, I was very, very well fed. And just from sheer experience, this is the way to do it.
Yeah. I'm sure you enjoyed that restaurant meal.
Everyone has their own way. What couldn't I have done without? I couldn't have done without the bike. I couldn't have done without my stove, my tent, my sleeping bag. I had my kit down to a bare minimum, so but with a little bit of safety, so that I wouldn't get cold, particularly at night. There was nothing certain.
You were very trim in your packing, I think. and you had, you know, it probably comes from a lifetime of D&V expeditions and making sure there's no excess items in your backpack. But yeah, it was a very trim package that you were carrying. So we've got a question about the natural landscape. So did you notice any changes in the natural landscape between this cycle and when you did the walk in 2005?
Yes, a lot of the forest has been clear felled and is being restocked. And I'm conscious that whereas in the original planting of 50 or 60 years ago, the watershed had survived, often just as a forest ride with the remains of a rotting fence going up the middle, but it had survived. Yeah. In the restocking, that is not necessarily the case, and I'm vexed that the Forestry Commission have not used the powers and the legislation that they do have to protect areas that are of some significance. I mean, obviously they protect archaeological areas and areas of bog and so on, but the Forestry Commission have not picked up on my suggestion that they should have done. A lot more wind farms, wind turbines. I passed Blacklaw Wind Farm, which is just south of Shotts, and that could have been used as the model for all the subsequent wind farms. At one time, it was the biggest in Scotland. It isn't anymore, but some of it is I was going to say planted. It is on an area of former open cast coal extraction, and it was just left as a moonscape, and it was taken half a century to recover. But when the turbines were constructed, part of the deal was that the company would reinstate a heathland, moorland habitat, and you can now go to the car park at the wind farm, and it'll tell you all the flora and fauna that's now growing there. So why that hasn't been replicated elsewhere, I don't know. There has been more done in certain areas in terms of creating native woodland. The Borders Forest Trust doing a tremendous job. Carew Estate. Reforesting Scotland have now identified a huge area in Kintail, which will stretch halfway across Scotland, which in time, I mean, they've obviously made a start, will create a huge area of native forest. And obviously the work that the RSPB has done in the Flow Country is transforming it back to nearer what it was. So those are the kind of highlights in terms of changes, some good, some bad.
Great, thank you. Right, so we've got another question. What were the best and worst days of your challenge? Have you got a highlight? Have you got one day that was like, yay, that was the best day, and another day that was like, sad face?
The day I arrived in Shotts, I was
would make anybody sad.
I mean, I'm not going to take a swipe at Shotts because, as I discovered in my family history, some part of my family, the Kirkpatricks, originated in Shotts. Quite what they were doing there, I don't know. But it was wet. It had been raining, and I just couldn't fancy trying to find somewhere safe to camp. And where I would be able to get decent drinking water. So I confess, I went home for the night by the train and then came back. That was the only one. The highlight, well, I would come back to going through Redorach. Probably the first day going through Redorach, because I just love the place. It has something magical about it, and the couple that own it and run it do a quite incredible job. And just because they've got 12,000 acres or something doesn't mean they make a fortune. In fact, they scrape a living. but they're absolute, it's lifestyle.
Yeah.
So the sort of social part of that landscape, and they're doing a lot to regenerate wherever possible.
Yeah.
So
that
was a
sounds
highlight.
really lovely.
Yeah. And I like the wee hitchhiker.
Absolutely. You made a friend there, didn't you? Right, Peter, we're running out of time. We've still got quite a few questions, so we're going to go to a bit of a quick fire. So want some kind of snappy answers to some of these questions. So to someone who's been really inspired by your journey, and I have to say from the comments in the chat, lots of people think this is a fantastic adventure and has been really inspirational to other people. But if somebody wasn't an experienced cyclist or walker, what are your top 3 tips for starting out? What are the 3 important things if you're going to make this journey?
The first thing is proper planning and preparation. It has to be well planned and prepared. There's no question about that. Without that, it would be a fiasco. Have all the right gear. And that doesn't necessarily mean the most expensive, but having the right gear and knowing how to use it, it is essential. And you'd have to be fairly fit. So
great.
Boom, boom, boom.
Yeah, fantastic. Right, this is brilliant. Right, so did you learn anything new about yourself? Deep philosophical question there.
I learned to my delight that at my age I'm still capable of doing it. I've had health problems, a replumbed heart 10 years ago, whenever it is, a reconstituted ankle. And to think that I can still do it at the age of 74, that was just a joy.
Yeah, it was a fantastic, really, really fantastic thing to do. Right, we've got one short question, and then we're going to invite Laura, who's here from Edinburgh Young Carers, to just say thank you. We'll give her a voice to do that. But we've got a question from Archie Crosby, who wants to know, how fast were you cycling?
I cycled about 940 kilometers. I don't know what that is in miles. So it was quite a long way, not as long as I walked,
Right.
but that's the distance, Archie. And
what was your sort of speed? What was your daily speed?
Well, the average daily speed was probably about 10 kilometers an hour when I was cycling. I was using Strava most of the time, and that would tell me the speed I was doing when I was cycling. But I will tell you something, Archie. Strava tells you all sorts of analytical stuff, and including the fastest speed that you did that day. And there was one day on a particular stretch where I was doing 53 kilometers an hour.
Wow.
That's Zoom stuff. I couldn't believe it. Now, okay, miles an hour, I don't know what that would be, but and I was going downhill, but it's things like that. Just love.
Yeah.
So thank you for the question.
Downhills definitely help, don't they? Thanks, Archie, for your question. That was wonderful. So, Peter, we're going to conclude the questions now, but we're going to invite Laura, who's here from Edinburgh Young Carers, just to say thank you. She's been out on projects with us, and we've been sharing some wonderful moments with some of the young people that she supports. So Laura, we'll just, if you want to, you're off mute. Yeah, you want to just have a moment.
I'm a bit emotional, Peter. I don't know. I hope I don't start sobbing in the middle of this. But first of all, I just want to say I'm truly inspired by everything you've done for our young people, and you're the kind of person with your knowledge, your passion that I'm grateful to get to meet in my path. So I'm grateful for just to know that someone like you exists in the planet. Thank you so much, because our young people, especially the people I work with, impacted by their parental alcohol and drug misuse, really enjoyed working with the Green Team and with Sarah, with all the volunteers. Eliane was with us as well. So a huge thank you for all the people that joined the groups and made everything possible. And thank you for all you've done. Honestly, I'm blown away, and you become a legend in my team. Everybody was saying, we want to meet him. So hopefully we can manage to do meeting face to face at some point, considering that with the amount of money that you raised, we might, work together for quite a while. So yeah, I am just, speechless. So thank you. And thank you to Penny for coming to the last group and being, great with the young people. And I'm just speechless.
Oh, Lara, well, we'll let you go, but thank you for those words. And yeah, we're really excited to be working with you guys next year. We'll maybe get Peter out and come onto a project at some point. So
yeah,
thank you for that.
And all the young people can't wait to go camping. I cannot stop them from asking me. But yeah, after what Peter said about the journey, I think the summer would be the best time. Because
Great, lovely. Well, thank you for your thanks, and just finally, thank you to Peter. It's been absolutely amazing, and you brought it to life, and we're so grateful to you for doing this fundraising effort. And wow, way over the 5,000 fundraising target, which isn't to say that if you haven't already donated and you want to, the Givey code is in the chat. But I think probably most people here have been the greatest supporters of this fundraising effort. So absolutely brilliant. So thank you again. We've got a virtual applause for Peter for his talk, but we'll let you go now. And thank you to everybody for coming.